They laughed at the woman they called a failure, never imagining that before the night was over, the most powerful man in the city would stand before them and call her something entirely different. Lorraine Bennett sat quietly at the center of the long dining table as golden light from the chandelier reflected off crystal glasses and polished silverware. The private banquet room at a well-known Chicago restaurant had been reserved months in advance for her 50th birthday. Balloons in soft gold and cream floated near the ceiling. A three-tier cake stood proudly on a decorated table in the corner. Family photographs from decades of birthdays, graduations, and holiday gatherings lined a display wall. To anyone passing by, it looked like a celebration filled with love. But appearances could be deceptive. Lorraine forced a smile as another round of laughter echoed across the room. Her younger brother, Calvin, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with amusement. 50 years old, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Can you believe it? Lorraine made it to the half-century mark without ever catching a husband. The room erupted. Glasses clinked. A few relatives covered their mouths while laughing. Others made no effort to hide their amusement. Lorraine lowered her eyes toward her untouched slice of birthday cake. She had learned long ago how to survive moments like these. Smile politely. Stay quiet. Let the joke pass. Her younger sister, Denise, raised her wine glass. To Lorraine, she announced. The only woman I know who managed to avoid marriage for 5 entire decades. More laughter followed. Lorraine felt heat rising behind her eyes, but she refused to let the tears appear. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone. The truth was that Lorraine had spent most of her life taking care of other people. When their father became sick, she had postponed her own plans to help. When their mother needed daily care years later, Lorraine had been the one driving to appointments, organizing medications, and sleeping on uncomfortable hospital chairs. When nieces and nephews needed babysitting, tutoring, or emergency help, Lorraine had always answered the phone. Yet somehow none of those sacrifices seemed memorable tonight. The only thing anyone wanted to discuss was the fact that she had never married. Across the room, cousins exchanged knowing looks. One aunt whispered something that caused another relative to laugh, so hard she nearly spilled her drink. Lorraine recognized the expression on their faces. It was pity disguised as humor. They believed they were being playful. They never understood how deeply their words landed. A server passed through the room carrying fresh drinks while a playlist of old love songs floated through hidden speakers. The irony was impossible to ignore. Love songs filled the air while Lorraine sat surrounded by people who had reduced her entire life to a missing wedding ring. She glanced toward the display of family photos. Decades of memories stared back at her. In every picture she was present, smiling, helping, supporting, standing beside everyone else's milestones. Yet somehow she had become invisible inside her own story. Then Calvin stood again, tapping his fork gently against his glass. Wait until you see the gift we got her, he announced with a grin. The room instantly quieted. Several relatives exchanged excited smiles. Whatever surprise they had planned, they clearly thought it was hilarious. Lorraine felt a knot tighten in her stomach as every eye turned toward her. And for the first time that evening, she sensed that the worst moment of the night had not happened yet. Lorraine forced herself to smile as relatives leaned forward in anticipation of whatever surprise Calvin and Denise had prepared. The uneasy feeling in her stomach grew stronger with every passing second. She had known her family long enough to recognize that particular look in their eyes. It was the same look they wore whenever they convinced themselves that embarrassment was harmless fun. Denise disappeared briefly toward the gift table and returned carrying a large wrapped box decorated with a bright silver bow. Several cousins immediately began laughing before the gift was even opened. Calvin grinned and folded his arms. Come on, Lorraine, he said. Open it. We spent a lot of time finding the perfect present. Lorraine glanced around the room. For a moment, she considered refusing. But 50 pairs of eyes were already fixed on her. Slowly, she reached for the box and untied the ribbon. The room became quiet with anticipation. She lifted the lid and froze. Inside was a tablet computer already turned on. On the screen was the profile page of a senior dating application. Her photograph had been uploaded. Her name, age, and personal information were already displayed. Beneath the profile picture appeared a large headline that read, "Looking for Mr. Right before 60." The room exploded with laughter. One cousin nearly choked on his drink. An aunt covered her face while laughing. Denise leaned against the table, unable to contain herself. "We even paid for the premium membership," she said proudly. "You are welcome." Lorraine stared at the screen. She felt as though the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. The laughter sounded distant now, like noise coming from another building. Her hands tightened around the edge of the box. For everyone else, it was a joke. For Lorraine, it was 30 years of sacrifice reduced to a punchline. Nobody in that room remembered the nights she spent caring for their mother after surgery. Nobody mentioned the weekends she gave up helping raise children who were not her own. Nobody remembered the job opportunities she declined because someone in the family always needed help. They only saw a woman who had reached 50 without a husband. "Maybe this will finally solve the mystery," Calvin joked. "There has to be somebody out there." More laughter followed. Lorraine stood slowly from her chair. Her smile had completely disappeared. A heavy silence briefly settled over the people closest to her table. For the first time, some of them realized they may have gone too far. Lorraine carefully placed the tablet back into the box. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes glistened under the chandelier light. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one apologized. Most simply watched in uncomfortable silence as she disappeared through the banquet room doors. Outside, the evening air felt cool against her skin. Chicago's skyline shimmered in the distance while traffic lights reflected across rain-darkened pavement. Lorraine crossed her arms and stood alone beside a row of decorative planters. For the first time all evening, she allowed a single tear to escape. She quickly wiped it away. Inside the restaurant, the party continued without her. But 3 blocks away, a convoy of black sport utility vehicles turned onto the avenue. Their headlights cut through the night as they moved with quiet precision toward the very building where Lorraine Bennett stood alone, unaware that a chapter of her life she believed had ended decades ago was about to return. Lorraine remained beside the restaurant entrance, staring at the reflections of city lights shimmering across the wet pavement. The sounds of laughter from inside still drifted through the glass doors, faint but impossible to ignore. Every burst of amusement felt like another reminder that she had somehow become the joke of her own birthday celebration. She wrapped her arms around herself and took a slow breath. The cool evening air carried the scent of rain and passing traffic. Normally, moments of solitude helped her find peace. Tonight felt different. Tonight the loneliness felt heavier. Behind her, inside the banquet room, conversations slowly resumed. A few relatives expressed mild concern, but most quickly returned to their food and drinks. Calvin shrugged as he reached for another appetizer. "She is too sensitive," he said. "We were trying to have fun." Denise nodded in agreement. Exactly. Nobody meant anything by it. Yet even as they defended themselves, a small discomfort settled over several family members. Deep down, they knew Lorraine had spent decades showing up whenever someone needed help. They knew she had sacrificed more than most of them ever had. But admitting that would have required acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. It was easier to laugh than to reflect. Outside, Lorraine walked slowly toward a decorative stone bench near the corner of the building. She sat down and looked across the street. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about the question she usually avoided. What would her life have looked like if she had chosen herself instead of everyone else? There had been opportunities. There had been dreams. There had even been someone once. A faint smile touched her lips before quickly disappearing. That chapter belonged to another lifetime. A lifetime she had long ago convinced herself to forget. The distant hum of engines interrupted her thoughts. Lorraine glanced down the avenue and noticed several black sport utility vehicles approaching in a neat line. Their polished exteriors reflected the city lights as they moved through traffic with quiet confidence. She barely paid attention at first. Chicago was full of wealthy people. Expensive vehicles were nothing unusual. Yet something about this convoy felt different. One by one, the vehicles slowed as they neared the restaurant. Then they pulled toward the curb directly in front of the building. Lorraine frowned. Across the street, pedestrians slowed their pace. A valet employee standing near the entrance straightened immediately. Even through the glass, several guests inside the banquet room began turning toward the windows. The convoy came to a complete stop. The engines fell silent. For a moment, the entire scene seemed frozen in place. Then the doors opened. Several sharply dressed men stepped out first. Their movements were calm and professional. They exchanged a few quiet words before looking toward the restaurant entrance. Inside the banquet room, conversations died away. Curious relatives abandoned their tables and moved toward the windows. Calvin pressed closer to the glass. "Who is that?" someone whispered. Denise adjusted her necklace nervously as more guests gathered behind her. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The laughter from earlier had vanished. In its place was a strange anticipation. Lorraine remained seated on the bench, unaware that dozens of eyes were now moving between her and the arriving convoy. Then the rear door of the final vehicle opened. A tall man stepped onto the sidewalk. Silver touched his dark hair at the temples, but his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being. Notice the moment he entered a room. The city seemed to pause around him, and as his eyes slowly scanned the area in front of the restaurant, they settled on Lorraine Bennett. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Lorraine remained seated on the stone bench while the stranger stood beside the row of black vehicles, his attention fixed entirely on her. There was something familiar about him, though she could not immediately understand why. The distance between them was no more than 40 feet, yet it felt as though decades stood in the way. Around them, the city continued its rhythm. Cars passed. Traffic lights changed. A cold breeze moved through the street. But Lorraine barely noticed any of it. Inside the restaurant, nearly every face was now pressed toward the windows. Calvin squinted through the glass. Denise folded her arms nervously. Even relatives who had spent the evening laughing moments earlier had fallen silent. One of the restaurant employees stepped toward the entrance and whispered something to another staff member. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Curiosity had replaced amusement. The tall man finally began walking forward. His pace was unhurried, confident, and deliberate. The polished leather of his shoes reflected the glow of the streetlights. His charcoal overcoat moved gently with each step. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms, private meetings, and rooms full of people waiting for him to speak. Lorraine stood slowly from the bench. Her heart began to beat faster, though she could not explain why. As the man approached, she noticed the silver at his temples and the lines near his eyes that only time could create. Yet there was something unchanged beneath the years, something she had not seen in a very long time. He stopped several feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them. Then his expression softened. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough for Lorraine to glimpse a warmth that seemed strangely familiar. "Lorraine Bennett," he said quietly. The sound of her name in his voice sent an unexpected chill through her chest. He spoke it carefully, almost reverently, as though it were something precious. Lorraine searched his face. "Do I know you?" she asked. A faint smile appeared. It was not the smile of a stranger. It was the smile of someone carrying a memory. "I was beginning to wonder if I would ever get the chance to ask you that question myself." Lorraine stared at him. Her confusion deepened. Across the street, a group of pedestrians slowed to watch. Behind the restaurant windows, relatives exchanged puzzled looks. Calvin pushed through the front doors and stepped onto the sidewalk, followed closely by Denise and several others. Nobody wanted to miss whatever was happening. The man glanced briefly toward the growing audience before returning his attention to Lorraine. One of the men from the convoy approached, carrying a carefully wrapped rectangular package. Without a word, he handed it over and stepped back. Lorraine watched as the stranger accepted it with both hands. Then he extended it toward her. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Lorraine hesitated before taking the package. It felt surprisingly light. She looked up at him again. "I do not understand." "You will," he replied softly. "After 30 years, I think it is finally time." The word struck her like an echo from another life. 30 years. Lorraine's breath caught. Somewhere deep inside her memory, a forgotten door began to open. And as she carefully loosened the ribbon around the package, she had no idea that the photograph waiting inside was about to change everything she believed she knew about her past. The ribbon slipped from Lorraine's fingers as she slowly opened the package. The crowd gathered near the restaurant entrance watched in complete silence. Even the sounds of the city seemed distant now. Inside the box rested a simple wooden frame, worn slightly at the corners by age. Lorraine lifted it carefully and felt her breath catch. The photograph inside had been taken 30 years earlier. A much younger Lorraine stood beneath the bright summer sun, wearing a denim jacket and holding a paper cup of lemonade. Her smile was effortless. Her eyes were full of dreams she had not yet surrendered. Beside her stood a young man with dark hair and an expression of quiet determination. Time had changed his face, but not enough to erase recognition. Lorraine stared at the photograph and slowly looked up. The man standing before her was the same man from the picture. The years disappeared all at once. Memories she had buried beneath decades of responsibility rushed back with startling clarity. A small community fundraiser. Folding tables set up in a church parking lot. Children running through sprinklers on a hot afternoon. Long conversations that stretched until sunset. And a young man named Damien Whitmore who had arrived with little more than ambition and hope. "Damien," she whispered. His smile widened gently. "Hello, Lorraine." For a moment neither spoke. They simply stood there looking at one another, separated by 30 years of missed moments. Around them, relatives exchanged confused glances. Calvin frowned. Denise looked from the photograph to Damien and back again. None of them understood what they were witnessing. Lorraine shook her head slightly as though trying to make sense of a dream. "I thought you were gone forever." Damien lowered his gaze briefly before looking back at her. "I thought you had forgotten me." Lorraine laughed softly through gathering tears. "Forgotten you?" she said. "I spent years wondering what happened to you." The honesty in her voice surprised even her. Damien nodded slowly. "Then we were both asking the same question." A heavy silence followed. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people realizing that time had stolen far more than either of them had understood. Damien glanced at the photograph in her hands. "You kept me going longer than you ever knew." Lorraine looked confused. "What are you talking about?" He gestured toward the picture. "That summer, I had almost given up on everything. Every opportunity seemed closed. Every plan kept falling apart. Then I met you." Lorraine stared at him. She remembered encouraging him. She remembered believing in him when very few people did. But she had never imagined those conversations mattered beyond that season of her life. Damien's eyes softened. "You were the first person who looked at me and saw possibility instead of limitations." Behind them, several family members shifted uncomfortably. The jokes from earlier now felt painfully distant. Lorraine looked down at the photograph again. She noticed something she had missed before. Tucked inside the frame was a folded piece of yellowed paper. Carefully, she slid it free. The paper was old, fragile, and covered with handwriting. Damien immediately recognized it. His expression changed. "You still have that." Lorraine unfolded the note with trembling fingers. Then her eyes widened. Because written at the bottom, beneath words she had not read in 3 decades, was a promise she suddenly remembered as clearly as the day it had been made. A promise that neither of them had ever forgotten. The paper trembled slightly in Lorraine's hands as she stared at the faded handwriting. The ink had softened with age, but every word remained clear. 30 years seemed to vanish in an instant. Around them, family members stood frozen near the restaurant entrance, watching a story unfold that none of them knew existed. Lorraine read the final line again. "I will come back for you, no matter how long it takes." Her eyes lifted slowly toward Damien. The city lights reflected in the moisture gathering along her lashes. "You actually remembered," she whispered. Damien let out a quiet laugh, filled with equal parts disbelief and relief. "Remembered?" he said softly. "Lorraine, I carried that promise through every city, every meeting, every year." The words settled over her like a warm current. For so long she had convinced herself that chapter of her life had simply ended. Back then, Damien had been ambitious, determined, and uncertain about his future. Lorraine had been hopeful, optimistic, and ready to build a life of her own. They had spent one unforgettable summer talking for hours beneath church picnic tents, walking through neighborhood festivals, and sharing dreams that seemed larger than reality itself. Then opportunity had arrived unexpectedly for Damien. A business mentor offered him a chance to leave Chicago and build something bigger. Lorraine remembered encouraging him to go. She remembered insisting that he should never sacrifice his future because of fear. What she did not know was how difficult that goodbye had been for him. Damien glanced toward the old note. "I wrote to you 3 months after I left." Lorraine frowned. "I never received a letter." Damien looked surprised. "I wrote again 6 months later." Lorraine shook her head. "I never received that one either." The confusion between them deepened. Damien stared into the distance as though replaying old memories. "I kept writing," he said. "Birthdays, holidays, milestones, every year." Lorraine felt her pulse quicken. Every year. Not every single year, Damien admitted, but enough that I stopped counting. The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence before it. Somewhere behind Lorraine, Denise exchanged a nervous glance with Calvin. Neither sibling looked comfortable anymore. Lorraine remained focused entirely on Damien. "Why did you never come back?" she asked quietly. Damien's expression softened. "Because every letter I sent eventually stopped coming back. I thought you had moved on. I thought you were married." Lorraine almost laughed at the irony. Married? The very thing her family had mocked her for only an hour earlier. "I never married," she said. Damien nodded slowly. "I know that now." His voice carried a sadness that could only come from lost time. "But 30 years ago, I did not." A cool breeze moved through the street. The old note fluttered gently in Lorraine's hand. Suddenly she realized something. The paper had been carefully preserved. The photograph had been protected. The promise had been remembered. Damien had not brought these items tonight by accident. He had carried them for decades. Not because they represented the past, because they represented unfinished hope. Lorraine looked at him differently now. Not as the powerful businessman standing before her. Not as the man who arrived surrounded by luxury vehicles and attention. She saw the young dreamer from the photograph. The young man who once believed her kindness had changed his life. And as Damien reached into the inside pocket of his coat and slowly removed a thick bundle of neatly tied envelopes, Lorraine's heart skipped a beat, because every envelope carried her name. The bundle of envelopes seemed impossibly heavy despite their age. Lorraine stared at her own name written again and again across dozens of sealed letters. Some envelopes were slightly faded. Others looked newer. Different stamps. Different postmarks. Different years. Yet every one of them carried the same destination. Her. For several seconds, she could not speak. She carefully reached toward the stack and touched the top envelope with trembling fingers. It felt like touching 30 years of unanswered questions. Damien watched quietly. His expression carried none of the confidence that had surrounded him when he stepped from the convoy. In that moment, he looked vulnerable, hopeful, almost afraid. "I kept them," he said softly. "The ones that came back." Lorraine looked up. "Came back." He nodded. "Returned. Undeliverable. No forwarding address. Recipient unavailable. Every explanation imaginable." He gave a small laugh that carried no humor. "At first I thought you had moved. Then I thought you did not want to hear from me." Lorraine felt her chest tighten. "I never saw any of these." The certainty in her voice was immediate. Absolute. Damien believed her instantly. He had spent enough years wondering to recognize the truth when he heard it. Behind them, the crowd of relatives remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody wanted to draw attention to themselves. The evening had shifted beyond their control. Lorraine slowly untied the ribbon around the bundle. One envelope slipped free. The date stamped across the corner stopped her cold. It had been mailed 6 months after Damien left Chicago. 30 years ago. Her fingers shook as she opened it. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. Lorraine began reading silently. Within seconds, tears filled her eyes. Damien had written about his first small apartment, his long workdays, his fears, his dreams. Most of all, he had written about missing her. Not dramatically, not poetically, simply and honestly. He wanted to know how she was doing. He wanted to hear her voice again. He wanted to keep the promise they made. Lorraine lowered the letter. "I would have answered," she whispered. "I know." Damien's reply came without hesitation. Something about his certainty made her look at him more closely. "How can you be so sure?" Damien glanced toward the restaurant entrance. His eyes briefly settled on Calvin and Denise before returning to Lorraine. "Because 2 years after I mailed the first letter, I came back." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Lorraine blinked. "You came back." "I stood outside your mother's house." The color slowly drained from several faces near the entrance. Damien continued speaking calmly. Someone answered the door. Lorraine stared at him. "Who?" Damien's eyes shifted once more toward her siblings. This time, everyone noticed. Calvin suddenly looked away. Denise folded her arms tightly. An uncomfortable silence spread through the group. Lorraine felt her heartbeat quicken. "What happened?" she asked. Damien took a slow breath. "I was told you were engaged." The words landed like a stone. Lorraine froze. "What?" "I was told you were happy. That you had moved on. That contacting you would only complicate your life." Lorraine turned slowly toward her family. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became understanding. And for the first time that night, several people could not meet her eyes. Because buried beneath 3 decades of misunderstandings was a truth that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Lorraine had experienced all evening. She looked from Damien to her siblings and back again, waiting for someone to tell her she had misunderstood. Nobody did. Calvin stared at the sidewalk. Denise suddenly seemed fascinated by the restaurant sign above the entrance. Their silence answered the question before words ever could. Lorraine felt 30 years of confusion rearranging themselves inside her mind. Every birthday card that never arrived. Every holiday she spent wondering. Every quiet moment when she convinced herself that Damien had simply forgotten. None of it had been true. Why? She asked softly. The question was not directed at Damien. It was directed at the people who had shared her childhood, her home, and her life. Calvin finally cleared his throat. We thought we were protecting you. Lorraine stared at him in disbelief. Protecting me? Denise stepped forward. You have to understand how it looked back then. He left. Then suddenly he came back driving expensive cars and talking about business opportunities. We did not know what kind of world he was getting involved in. Damien remained silent. Lorraine noticed that he made no effort to defend himself. He simply allowed the truth to emerge. Denise continued. Mom was worried. We were worried. We thought if you waited for him, you might waste your life. Lorraine almost laughed at the irony. Waste her life. The words echoed painfully inside her chest. She slowly looked around at the faces gathered near the entrance. The same people who had spent the evening mocking her for being alone were now explaining why they had helped keep her that way. No one seemed to realize the contradiction. Damien finally spoke. So you decided for her. His voice remained calm, but every word landed with quiet weight. Nobody answered. Because there was no answer that could make the choice sound reasonable. Lorraine lowered her gaze toward the bundle of letters. 30 years of conversations she never received. 30 years of opportunities stolen not by fate, but by assumptions. Yet strangely, she felt less anger than sadness. Time had already taken enough from all of them. Damien took a slow step closer. I did not come here tonight to blame anyone. The relatives looked surprised. I spent too many years doing that already. He smiled faintly. Eventually, I realized blame does not give you time back. Lorraine looked at him. There was wisdom in his eyes now, the kind that only comes from carrying disappointment for a very long time. Damien reached into his coat once more. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances, unsure what would happen next. This time he removed a small velvet box. The sight of it immediately drew every eye in the crowd. Lorraine's breath caught. Damien held the box carefully, almost reverently. I bought this a long time ago, he said. Much longer ago than I care to admit. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Calvin looked completely stunned. Denise covered her mouth. Damien opened the box. Inside rested a simple, elegant ring. Nothing flashy. Nothing excessive. Just something beautiful that had clearly been chosen with care. Lorraine stared at it, unable to speak. Damien looked directly at her, and for the first time that evening, his composure seemed to crack. 30 years of waiting stood behind his next words. There was never anyone else for me, Lorraine. The world seemed to stand still after Damien spoke those words. There was never anyone else for me, Lorraine. The city lights glowed softly around them. The restaurant behind them had become silent. Even the people who had spent the evening laughing now looked as though they were witnessing something sacred. Lorraine stared at the small ring resting inside the velvet box. For years she had believed that life had quietly passed her by. She had watched friends marry, raise families, celebrate anniversaries, and build futures together. She had smiled for photographs, attended weddings, purchased gifts, and returned home alone. Eventually, she stopped asking why certain dreams never happened for her. She told herself that acceptance was easier than disappointment. Yet standing before her now was living proof that some stories do not end simply because time passes. Some stories wait. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked at Damien. 30 years, she whispered. Damien nodded. 30 years. Lorraine laughed softly through her tears. That is a very long time to keep a promise. A warm smile touched his face. You were worth waiting for. Several relatives lowered their heads. No one knew what to say. The jokes from earlier now felt painfully small. The woman they had pitted all evening suddenly seemed like the strongest person among them. Lorraine had spent decades giving love away without asking for recognition. She had cared for family members when they were sick. She had sacrificed opportunities without complaint. She had shown up whenever someone needed her. And somehow, despite everything, her heart had remained kind. Damien closed the ring. Boxed gently. Then he offered her his hand. Not with pressure. Not with expectation. Simply with respect. Lorraine looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before placing hers in it. The crowd released a collective breath they did not realize they had been holding. Damien's eyes softened. Would you come back inside with me? Lorraine glanced toward the banquet room. Earlier that evening it had felt like the loneliest place in the city. Now it looked different. Not because the room had changed, but because she had. Together they walked back through the entrance. Every conversation stopped. I followed them. Calvin stepped forward first. His voice cracked slightly. Lorraine, I am sorry. Denise nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. So am I. Lorraine studied their faces. For the first time all evening, she saw genuine regret instead of amusement. She squeezed Damien's hand gently and smiled. Then let us not waste any more time. The tension in the room finally broke. People began smiling through tears. Someone quietly started the music again. A slow song drifted through the speakers. Damien turned toward Lorraine. May I have this dance? Lorraine laughed, a real laugh this time, bright and effortless. You may. As they stepped onto the small dance floor, the room seemed warmer than before. The birthday cake still stood in the corner. The balloons still floated near the ceiling. Yet everything felt transformed. Lorraine was no longer the woman people whispered about. She was no longer the punchline of a joke. She was simply Lorraine Bennett, a woman whose kindness had mattered more than she ever realized. As she and Damien moved slowly beneath the chandelier light, surrounded by family, memories, and second chances, it became clear that some gifts arrive exactly when they are meant to. Not early, not late, exactly on time. And that night, everyone in the room remembered what dignity looks like. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes that it is never too late for hope, love, and second chances.